The rain that evening didn't simply fall. It pounded from every direction, turning the quiet streets of Portland into flowing mirrors of light. Thunder rolled endlessly across the skyline, while quick streaks of lightning carved pale scars against the glass towers. By 9 o'clock, most people had already rushed indoors, hiding behind warm windows fogged with condensation. Only a few souls remained outside, and Claire Dawson was one of them. At 25, with damp strands of blonde hair sticking to her forehead beneath the hood of her sweatshirt, she pushed her worn bicycle along the slick pavement. The basket strapped to the back carried 2 heavy grocery bags, her last order of the night for the delivery service that kept her afloat. The weight of student loans and her father's medical bills left no choice but to keep going. She told herself that once this final delivery was done, she would ride home, curl into her only thick blanket, and forget about the storm outside. But this delivery was unlike the others. Her phone's map guided her away from the busy neighborhoods, past rows of dim shops and corner cafes, until she found herself on a hushed street lined with towering pines that leaned together in the rain. The road ended at a tall wrought iron gate. Behind it stood a mansion, cut off from the world. The estate loomed in darkness except for a single glowing window upstairs, a defiant flame against the storm. Claire hesitated, tightening her grip on the handlebars. This was not the kind of place she usually delivered to. Most customers lived in cramped apartments or modest duplexes, not sprawling mansions that carried the weight of wealth and secrecy. She climbed off her bike, wiped the rain from her lashes, and pressed the buzzer at the gate. For a long moment, nothing happened. The downpour pounded her shoulders, sliding cold streams down her back until she shivered. She wondered if the order had been a mistake. Then slowly the iron gate creaked open. Claire's shoes splashed against the long stone path as she walked toward the porch. The house towered over her, its windows staring like silent eyes. Balancing the grocery bags in her hands, she fought the rising urge to turn back. At last she reached the door and knocked. The handle clicked and the door swung open. The man standing before her looked younger than she had expected. Tall, early 30s at most, with dark hair that fell in careless strands across his forehead. His white shirt was wrinkled, the top buttons undone as though he had pulled it on without thought. But it was his eyes that held her still. They were the eyes of someone who had once seen too much brightness and then retreated into shadows. Tired, haunted yet startlingly direct. Rain spilled sideways through the doorway, flecking his shirt, but he didn't move. He only stood there watching her, as though he had been waiting for this exact knock. Claire cleared her throat, her voice unsteady from the cold as she lifted the grocery bags slightly. "Your order." He didn't reach for them. His gaze moved instead across her soaked jacket, her trembling fingers, the strands of wet hair clinging to her cheek. For a moment she thought he would close the door and vanish back into silence, but then he spoke. His voice was low and rough, as though unused for a long time. "You're drenched. Don't go back out there, stay, I'll keep you warm." The words weren't sharp nor commanding. They carried a weight that was softer, almost pleading, as if he had been starved of company and couldn't bear to let her vanish into the storm. Claire froze, stunned. She had delivered countless orders, exchanged polite thank yous through half-open doors, but never had someone asked her to step inside, much less to stay. She felt the storm pounding at her back, the uncertain warmth spilling from his hallway. Logic urged her to decline. Every instinct told her to walk away. Yet something in his voice, raw and unpolished, rooted her in place. Who was he? This solitary man in a mansion with only one window lit. Why would a millionaire, a man with the world at his fingertips, look at a delivery girl as though she were the answer to a loneliness he could not escape? And why on this relentless night of rain had he asked her to stay? Claire stood at the threshold, water dripping from her sleeves and pooling on the marble step beneath her feet. His invitation echoed in her mind, soft yet impossible to ignore. For 3 years she had delivered to strangers across the city, and never once had she stepped inside. The rules were clear. Hand over the order, confirm in the app, move on. No exceptions. But behind her, the storm roared like 1,000 warnings. And in front of her, the man's eyes carried not hunger, not threat, but a loneliness so sharp it felt like it had been carved into him. He wasn't asking for obedience. He was asking for understanding. Slowly, Claire crossed the threshold. The door closed behind her with a muffled thud, silencing the storm in an instant. She glanced around, still gripping the grocery bags as though they were a shield. The entryway stretched high above her, ceilings tall enough to swallow sound. A chandelier hung unlit, its crystal pieces dull without light. Only a single lamp glowed from a table against the wall, spilling soft amber across the polished floor. The house smelled faintly of cedar and rain, clean but empty. The man set the groceries on a side table without even looking at them. Instead, he reached for a folded towel resting on a nearby chair and held it out to her. The gesture was kind but awkward, like someone out of practice with the basics of care. "Thank you," Claire murmured, taking it from him. She began drying her hair, her eyes flicking up to study him. He moved slowly, deliberately, shoulders tense as though the presence of another person in his home was something unfamiliar, maybe even foreign. Her gaze drifted around the space. Though the mansion was beautiful, polished railings gleaming and antique details lining the hall, there was an emptiness to it. Dust lingered at the edges of picture frames and several rooms lay in darkness, their doors half closed. A grand piano sat against one wall, its lid shut, a fine film of dust across its surface as if untouched for months. No photographs. No laughter. No signs of life except the man before her. Claire's chest tightened. She shouldn't be here. She was standing in a stranger's mansion, with a storm raging outside and a man whose wealth could buy him anything, yet who lived in silence. She forced herself to break the heavy quiet. "Do you often invite delivery girls into your home?" she asked, sharper than she intended. The faintest twitch touched his lips, almost a smile, but it disappeared quickly. "No," he answered simply. "You're the first." That didn't comfort her. If anything, it made her grip the towel tighter. The silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Then his voice softened, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "You're safe here. You look so cold." There was something raw in the honesty of his tone that unsettled her more than arrogance would have. She had met all kinds of customers, rude, indifferent, sometimes kind, but no one had ever spoken with such unpolished gentleness, as though her shivering genuinely mattered. He gestured toward a doorway. "Would you like tea?" The word sounded strange in his mouth, as if he rarely asked anyone such a thing. Claire considered refusing. Every part of her training told her to decline. But another crack of thunder shook the windows and the storm outside answered for her. She found herself nodding. Yes, tea would be good. He disappeared into the kitchen, footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, leaving her in the vast, shadowed entry. She shifted from foot to foot, nerves still alive but curiosity weaving itself into the fear. Who was this man who lived surrounded by grandeur but wore grief like a second skin? Her eyes traveled up the staircase, across the chandelier, back to the piano collecting dust. The wealth was undeniable, but the warmth was missing. From somewhere deeper in the house she heard the faint clink of mugs, and she wondered, not for the first time that night, why this man had chosen silence over the world. The man returned carrying 2 steaming mugs. His movements were measured, careful, as though even this small act carried weight. He handed one to her without hesitation, and the warmth seeped through the ceramic into Claire's chilled fingers. He leaned against the wall with his own cup, watching her with a guarded expression. She lifted hers, sipping slowly, grateful despite herself. "You didn't have to let me in," she said at last, breaking the silence. "And you didn't have to stay," he replied, his tone even, though his eyes betrayed something deeper. The words lingered between them, simple but heavy. Claire's thoughts whirled. Was he dangerous, or just unbearably lonely? She searched his face, finding no arrogance there, only restraint, as though he was afraid of scaring her away. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable," he added after a moment, his voice rough with disuse. "It's quiet here most nights." The storm made it worse. Something in his admission rang true, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe he wasn't a threat, but a man drowning in silence. She studied him over the rim of her cup. His shirt clung damp against his collarbone, his dark hair tousled as if he'd run his hands through it too many times. He looked too young to live in such isolation. 32 perhaps, an age for friends, city lights, and laughter, not for shutting himself away in a shadowed mansion. Claire felt a flicker of empathy she hadn't expected. She knew what it was to carry unseen burdens. She knew the sting of being overlooked. The tea was warm, but her curiosity burned hotter. Why was he here alone? Why did his smile, rare and fleeting, seem haunted, as if tied to memories he couldn't outrun? "I'll leave once the rain eases," she told herself silently, gripping the mug a little tighter. But deep down, some part of her already sensed that tonight had changed everything. The groceries sat forgotten on the side table, and the storm continued its furious rhythm outside. Inside, two strangers stood in silence. Yet the silence was beginning to shift, less like danger, and more like the fragile edge of understanding. The storm outside refused to let up, thunder rattling the windows as though reminding her of the danger she had left behind. Claire sipped her tea slowly, trying to ignore how surreal it felt to be standing inside the mansion of a man whose name she didn't even know. He broke the silence first. His voice was low, rough around the edges, as though words were a language he wasn't used to speaking. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a beat, then answered. "Claire. And you?" she asked, her tone careful. "Julian," he said, after a pause so long it made her wonder if he had considered giving her another name. She nodded, repeating it silently. Julian. It fit the solemn air of the house, fit the shadows in his eyes. He gestured toward the towel she still clutched. "I'm sorry. I didn't have anything better." "It's fine," she replied. "Better than nothing." A flicker of a smile touched his lips, gone almost as quickly as it came. Another roll of thunder cracked across the sky, and she flinched despite herself. He noticed, tilting his head slightly. "Long night?" "You could say that," she murmured. "I've been delivering since noon. This is my last order." "You work for one of those services?" he asked, his brow lifting. "Whichever one is paying this week," she said, her voice edged with tired humor. "It covers the bills." Her tone carried resignation, and his gaze sharpened as if he heard more in her words than she intended to reveal. For a moment she thought he might ask more, why she was out in weather like this, what those bills were for. But instead he only said, "That must be exhausting." Claire shrugged, unwilling to let pity touch her. "It's just a job. Better than some others I've had." He studied her in silence for a long moment, then his expression shifted, almost thoughtful. "Have we met before?" The question caught her off guard. She frowned. "I don't think so. I grew up around here but moved away for a while." His eyes flickered as if recalling a memory buried deep. "You used to ride a red bike down this street. You crashed into the hedge outside that gate once. 10 years old, maybe? Hair flying, scraped knees. But you laughed even while bleeding." Claire's breath caught. The memory surfaced instantly. The sting of gravel in her skin, the dent in someone's mailbox, the heat of embarrassment. "That was me," she admitted softly. "I can't believe you remember." Julian's gaze warmed for the briefest instant, a rare flash of something human behind the walls. "I remember because you didn't cry," he said quietly. "You laughed." A small laugh escaped her now, half disbelieving. "My dad told me crying wouldn't fix anything, so I decided to pretend I was tougher than I felt." For the first time, the weight in the room shifted. The tension eased, and Claire saw Julian not just as a stranger, but as someone who had once witnessed a piece of her childhood. They weren't entirely strangers after all. The recognition unsettled Claire more than she wanted to admit. For years she had knocked on strangers' doors, dropped off bags of groceries, and vanished without leaving a trace. But here, in this silent house, she found herself remembered, seen in a way that was rare and oddly disarming. Julian rose from where he leaned against the wall and glanced toward the groceries still sitting on the table. "I suppose I should put those away." He lifted the bags and carried them into the kitchen. Claire followed reluctantly, unwilling to stand alone in the vast entryway with its silent chandelier and dust-covered piano. The kitchen was modern and spacious, yet it too bore signs of neglect. A single pan rested on the stove, clean but unused. The refrigerator hummed faintly as Julian placed each item inside with the kind of precision that came from habit rather than necessity, as though his life had narrowed down to quiet. "Repetitive routines. You live here alone?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Yes," he replied, clipped and final. She considered pressing, but something in his tone warned her not to. His solitude was written in every corner of the house. Instead, she tried another question. "Do you always order groceries yourself?" "No assistant, no staff?" He shut the fridge gently. "I prefer it this way. Too many people make noise." Claire raised her brows. "Most people would welcome the help." "Noise isn't the same as company," he answered. The words lingered in the air, heavy in their honesty. She leaned against the counter, her clothes still damp but beginning to lose their chill. Her gaze drifted back toward the unlit rooms, the empty staircase, the way only one lamp seemed to keep the darkness from swallowing the house whole. "Why did you leave the light on upstairs?" she asked suddenly. "It was the only window lit when I arrived." Julian met her eyes steadily. "Because if you turn off every light, the darkness feels permanent." Her breath caught at the quiet confession. He didn't elaborate and she didn't press, but the words struck something deep in her. Outside, the storm softened from a furious torrent to a steady rhythm. The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence. Claire glanced toward the front door, her sense of duty pulling at her again. "I should go," she murmured. More to herself than to him. He didn't argue, though a flicker of disappointment passed quickly across his face. "Thank you for staying long enough to warm up." She set her empty mug on the counter, tugged her hood back over her damp hair and nodded. "And thank you for the tea, for the towel." Julian inclined his head, restrained but sincere. He followed as she moved toward the door, though he kept his distance as if afraid to reveal how much he wanted her to stay. At the threshold she paused. The storm was softer now but still present. He leaned against the frame, watching her with that unreadable expression. "Drive safe," he said. She lifted her bike from where it rested against the porch. The words felt strange on her ears, as though he hadn't spoken them in years. She mounted the bike, ready to leave, yet something in her chest resisted. As she rode down the stone path, she glanced back once. Julian was still there, silhouetted in the doorway, the lamp behind him painting him in gold against the storm. And though she couldn't explain why, the sight stayed with her long after the mansion disappeared into the rain. The following days blurred together in the familiar rhythm of deliveries and damp nights. But Claire found her thoughts circling back to the mansion more often than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was nothing more than curiosity, the same restless wondering she sometimes felt about the strangers behind the doors she knocked on each day. Yet deep down she knew it was different. There had been something in Julian's eyes that refused to fade from memory. One gray evening after a long shift, her route brought her near that neighborhood again. Her heart tapped faster when she recognized the iron gate through the mist. She had no delivery scheduled there, no reason to stop. Still, her hands tightened on the handlebars, guiding her forward anyway. The mansion loomed as silent as before, its windows dark except for that same upstairs light. Claire dismounted, standing at the gate, silently arguing with herself. She had no business being here, and yet part of her longed to know if he would open the door again, if the loneliness and gentleness she had seen were real, or just her imagination. Before she could turn away, the gate groaned open on its own. He must have seen her from a camera, she realized. When she walked the stone path, Julian was already waiting at the door. This time he looked less startled, more prepared, as though he had known she would come back eventually. Claire lifted a hand in an awkward greeting. "I was passing by. Thought I'd check if you needed more groceries." The corner of his mouth curved faintly. "No groceries tonight. Only company." The words made her flush, caught between weariness and warmth. Still, she stepped inside. The house looked the same, but it felt different now. The shadows no longer pressed quite as heavily, the silence less hollow. He led her into the living room, where a fire burned low in the hearth, flames casting amber across the walls. The change surprised her. The house that had seemed lifeless before now glowed with something gentler. Julian poured 2 glasses of water instead of tea and settled across from her. In the flickering firelight, Claire saw him more clearly. His hands were steady, though faint scars traced his knuckles. His jaw was sharp but carried tension that rarely seemed to leave him. And his smile, when it appeared, was fleeting, fragile as though it had forgotten how to stay. "Why do you live here alone?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. He exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the flames. "Because it's easier than explaining." "Explaining what?" He swirled the water in his glass, gaze distant. "I lost something I couldn't replace." His words carried the weight of confession more than conversation. Claire's frown softened. "What was it?" His eyes glinted with pain. "Not what. Who?" His voice cracked on the single syllable, and the air in the room shifted. He leaned back, shadows deepening across his face. "She was my fiancée. We were supposed to be married last spring. There was an accident. A car, she didn't make it. I did, but sometimes I wish I hadn't. His voice dropped to a whisper. That's why I left everything. The company, the people, the noise. None of it mattered anymore. Claire's chest tightened. She had expected mystery, maybe scandal, but not grief this raw, this unhealed. The mansion wasn't just lonely. It was hollowed by loss. She searched for words, but every reply felt inadequate. Instead, she let silence stretch, letting him see she was listening without judgment. When Julian finally glanced at her, his eyes shimmered with something unshed. You remind me of her in small ways. Not your face, not your voice, just the way you looked at me that night, as if I was still here. As if I hadn't already disappeared with her. His honesty startled her, yet there was no hunger in it. Only the truth of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. He nodded, accepting the words without anger. People always say that, but you, that night, you didn't say anything. You just stood there shivering. But you stayed, and that felt different. She met his gaze across the firelight. Maybe because I know what it's like when people stop noticing. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? She hesitated, not ready to share her own scars. He seemed to recognize the boundary and didn't press. Instead, he sighed softly and asked, Do you believe people can heal? Claire thought of her father's fragile health, of the betrayal that had left her struggling with debts, of the nights she had wanted to give up but hadn't. Healing isn't about forgetting, she said finally. It's about finding something worth staying for. For the first time, a real smile curved across his lips. Faint, but true. And what makes something worth staying for? She didn't answer, but the question lingered between them like an ember refusing to die. The storm outside calmed to a drizzle, but neither Claire nor Julian moved toward the door. Hours slipped by as the fire dwindled, their conversation weaving through trivial topics. Books they had read, places in the city that had changed, the sound of rain on different rooftops. Each subject seemed small on the surface, yet beneath every word pulsed the deeper truth of two lives carrying unspoken weight. When Claire finally rose to leave, Julian didn't stop her, though his eyes followed her every step as if committing the moment to memory. At the door, he said quietly, Thank you for listening. She turned back, meeting his gaze. Sometimes that's all a person needs. Their eyes held for one breath longer before she stepped into the misty night. As she pedaled away, she realized she had learned more than his name. She had seen the shadow behind his haunted smile, and though it frightened her, it also drew her closer. 3 days passed before she saw the mansion again, and this time, it wasn't by accident. She told herself she was only following the route the delivery app gave her, that the algorithm had chosen the address, not her curiosity. But when the screen flashed the familiar street name, her pulse betrayed her denial. She pushed through the drizzle, city lights blurred against wet pavement until the iron gate appeared through the trees. The gate opened before she even dismounted, as though triggered by her presence alone. A ripple of unease passed through her, quickly replaced by something warmer, something like anticipation. Julian stood at the door, waiting. He wore a navy sweater, his hair damp as if he had been outside just moments earlier. The look on his face wasn't surprise, it was recognition, quiet and steady, as if he had known she would return. You again, he said, his voice stronger this time, though still carrying that restrained edge. Claire lifted the bag in her hands. Another order, apparently. His eyes flickered with something unreadable before softening. Or maybe it's fate. She rolled her eyes lightly, trying to mask the flutter in her chest. I think it's just the app. He stepped aside to let her in, the warmth of the house wrapping around her shoulders as she crossed the threshold. The entryway felt less daunting now, though the same lamp cast its lonely amber glow. Stay a while, Julian said. It's raining harder than it looks. The sound of the storm outside answered for her, so she followed him into the living room. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, painting the walls with golden light. On a side table sat an old record player, a vinyl spinning slowly. From the speakers drifted the low notes of a trumpet, soft, mournful, and beautiful. Claire paused, surprised by the unexpected sound. You like jazz? Julian poured her a cup of tea from a pot waiting on the tray. It fills the silence. Silence can be good, she offered. Not always, he said simply, settling across from her. Before she could reply, a golden retriever padded into the room, his fur still slightly damp from the rain. The dog sniffed the air once, then walked straight to her and curled against her feet as though he had known her for years. Claire bent down, stroking his head in surprise. "He likes you," Julian observed, faint wonder in his voice. "He doesn't usually warm up to people this quickly." She smiled softly, scratching the dog's ears. "Maybe he knows I'm harmless." Julian's gaze lingered on her, steady and unblinking, carrying a weight that made her shift slightly in her seat. For a long moment, the three of them sat together, the fire crackling, the music weaving through the quiet, the dog breathing softly at her feet. Finally, Julian spoke again, his voice low. "Do you believe in second chances?" Claire looked into her cup, debating how much to reveal. "Sometimes. Not always. Why?" He met her eyes, and in them she saw a raw ache that unsettled her. "Because I'm not sure if I deserve one." The confession sat between them, fragile and heavy, and Claire felt something in her chest twist because she too carried regrets, mistakes, and scars she didn't speak of. "Maybe it's not about deserving," she said carefully. "Maybe it's about needing." Julian studied her face as if memorizing the words. The record ended, the needle clicking softly in the silence. And for the first time, she realized that beneath his grief was something even more fragile, hope trying to find its way back. The storm outside showed no sign of stopping, so Claire stayed longer than she had planned. They spoke of small things, the kind that stitched strangers into something closer. Favorite books, childhood foods, the best places in Portland to watch the sunset. Each answer revealed fragments of who they were, glimpses of the people beneath the burdens they carried. When she finally rose to leave, Julian didn't try to stop her, but his eyes followed her to the door, quiet longing written in the way he stood too still. The next week unfolded with an odd rhythm. No matter where she pedaled, the rain seemed to follow, dragging her through streets slick with water and winds that cut through her jacket. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was always one address resting in the back of her mind. When the app once again led her to the iron gate, she didn't resist. The gate swung open almost instantly, as though it too had begun to recognize her. Julian was waiting at the doorway with the golden retriever by his side. The sight of both felt strangely familiar now, like stepping into a place that belonged less to her schedule and more to her life. Inside, she noticed subtle changes. Another lamp glowed in the hallway. The grand piano no longer bore its coat of dust. A faint scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Julian offered a sheepish smile when she caught the aroma. "I attempted cookies," he admitted, holding up a plate of uneven circles. Claire laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. "They don't look pretty, but let's see." She took a bite, nearly choking on her giggles. "Needs work, but points for effort." Julian shook his head, but his eyes warmed in a way she hadn't seen before. From then on, their evenings began to stretch into hours. Sometimes they cooked together, though Claire did most of the guiding while Julian stumbled through simple tasks with awkward determination, as though he hadn't shared a kitchen in years. Other times they sat in the living room watching NBA games, Harvey sprawled across the rug. Julian confessed he didn't understand basketball, but liked the roar of the crowd while Claire explained plays with surprising enthusiasm. One evening he led her to the piano. Running his fingers lightly across the keys, he said, "My mother insisted on lessons. I never appreciated it." "Play something," she urged. He hesitated, shoulders tense, then coaxed out a melody. The notes came hesitant at first, then smoother, weaving into the air like a memory half-remembered. Claire closed her eyes, letting the firelight warm her face as the sound carried through the room. When the final chord faded, she opened her eyes to find Julian watching her, as if her presence had made the music possible. Moments like these began to stitch themselves into the fabric of something neither dared to name. Claire started bringing small offerings with her, discounted bread from a bakery, a bouquet of wildflowers she'd found at the market. Julian, in turn, noticed details about her that others overlooked. How she took her tea without sugar, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when nervous, how her shoulders only relaxed after Harvey rested his head against her knee. The mansion itself began to shift. Shadows receded as more rooms were opened, more lamps lit, more laughter echoing off high ceilings. Harvey followed Claire from room to room, tail wagging, while Julian watched with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It had been so long since warmth lived here, and now it seemed to arrive with her. Yet beneath all the gentleness, something fragile lingered. A tension neither spoke aloud. Both of them carried heavy pasts. Both knew how easily comfort could shatter. Still, they chose to remain in the fragile present, savoring each small moment, as though the storm outside had brought them to the edge of something they weren't ready to name, but couldn't let go of either. The nights of easy laughter and gentle companionship could not last forever. The shadow of truth pressed closer, waiting for its moment. It came on an evening when the storm outside was fiercer than any before. The wind howled against the windows, rain hammering so hard it felt as if the world itself was trying to break inside. Claire had just finished drying Harvey with a towel after he dashed in from the rain. She was still laughing, her cheeks flushed from the dog's antics, when she noticed Julian watching her too intently. The firelight carved his face into sharper lines, and the weight in his eyes unsettled her. She set the towel aside. "What is it?" Julian turned toward the flames instead of answering. "I shouldn't have let this go on." His voice was raw, breaking the fragile calm they had built. Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Let what go on?" "This." His jaw clenched. "You and me. The dinners, the conversations, the way you've made this house feel alive again. I'm not supposed to want it." Her brows pulled together, confusion twisting into hurt. "Not supposed to? Why?" "Because I already failed once." His voice cracked, pouring out like the storm outside. "I had someone I was supposed to protect, someone I promised a future to. She's gone because I was too consumed with my work to see what mattered. And now I live with that every day." Claire's chest tightened as she listened. This was the wound at his core, the guilt that had hollowed him out. "Julian," she said softly, stepping closer, "you can't punish yourself forever." He shook his head violently, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. I wake up every night hearing the crash of metal, the shatter of glass. I see her face, and then you appear at my door with rain dripping from your hair. For the first time in months I feel something other than emptiness, and that terrifies me more than the loneliness ever did." Her throat closed, memories rushing back to her own scars. She thought of the man she had once trusted, the one who left her drowning in debt and shame, the one who had taught her that love could turn cruel when life grew difficult. She had built walls to survive. "You think you're the only one afraid?" she whispered. "Do you know what it feels like to give everything you have to someone, only to watch them walk away the moment things get hard? Do you know what it's like to be left with nothing but bills and silence?" Julian's head snapped toward her, his gaze sharp with recognition. His voice dropped gentler now. "I do. Different circumstances, but yes, I know." Their eyes locked, and in that silence lay a truth they had both avoided. They wanted each other. They needed each other, but they were terrified of repeating the past. The weight of it pressed too heavily. Claire stepped back suddenly, her body trembling. "I should go." Panic flickered across his face as he rose. "Claire, wait." She shook her head, pulling on her jacket with frantic hands. "If I stay any longer, I'll start believing this is real. And what if it isn't? What if you change your mind? What if one day you wake up and decide the silence is easier? Better to leave now than break later." Julian froze, his hands at his sides as though chained. The storm rattled the house with violent force, echoing the turmoil between them. He wanted to reach for her, to stop her, but guilt kept him rooted. Claire opened the door, rain slamming against her instantly, soaking her within seconds. She turned back once. Julian stood in the doorway, shoulders bowed, eyes filled with torment she couldn't bear to read. "Goodbye," she whispered, her words almost lost beneath the storm. Then she was gone, pedaling into the darkness, leaving behind the fragile warmth they had built. Julian stood in the doorway long after the fire dimmed, Harvey whining softly at his side. The mansion had never felt emptier, and for the first time he realized the silence he had once chosen now felt unbearable. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the storm reduced to a drizzle that clung to the air. Julian had not slept. He wandered the halls until dawn, haunted by the echo of Claire's goodbye. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of her, the towel draped over a chair, the half-eaten pizza box on the counter, the faint memory of her laughter in the walls. He poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't drink. Staring out the window at the endless trees, Harvey paced restlessly at his side, sensing his turmoil. For the first time, Julian felt the silence not as penance but as suffocation. By mid-afternoon, he could no longer stay still. Grabbing his coat, he stepped into the mist, Harvey barking once as if to cheer him on. He had no plan except one. He had to find her. The city pressed in on him after months of isolation. Traffic roared, neon lights flashed, and the noise grated against his nerves. But he followed the faint memory of her words, heading toward the small grocery where she sometimes picked up extra hours. When he pushed open the glass door, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The smell of cardboard and coffee filled the air. Behind the counter, arranging shelves, stood Claire. She froze when she saw him, her eyes widening. "Julian." Her voice carried both accusation and question. He stepped closer, heart pounding. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let you leave last night." Her arms crossed tightly. "You made it clear. You don't believe you deserve this. So why are you here?" He swallowed hard. "Because I'm afraid. But I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of failing again." Her chest rose and fell quickly, her gaze sharp. "You can't just say that and expect everything to change. You carry ghosts, Julian. If I'm going to stay, I need all of you, not just the pieces you think are safe." His throat tightened, but he nodded. "You're right. I've been hiding behind my grief because it felt easier than living. But when you walked away, I realized I don't want easier. I want real, even if it hurts." Claire's arms slowly dropped to her sides. Her expression softened despite herself. "I can't promise I'll never falter," Julian continued, his voice low, urgent. "But I can promise I won't run. Not from you. Not anymore." The store was nearly empty, the hum of refrigerators filling the silence. She searched his face for cracks, for hesitation, but found only sincerity, raw and unpolished but true. Finally she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing. "You have no idea how much it terrifies me too," she whispered. "Good," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then maybe we can be terrified together." A reluctant laugh broke from her, cutting the heaviness. Harvey's bark sounded from outside the glass door, and Claire glanced past Julian to see the dog wagging his tail in the drizzle. She shook her head, a smile tugging at her mouth. "You even brought backup." When her shift ended an hour later, Julian was waiting with Harvey. The walk to his car was quiet, but when he opened the passenger door, Claire hesitated only a moment before sliding in. The drizzle softened into mist as they drove back toward the mansion. Neither spoke much, but the silence was no longer hollow. It was filled with unspoken promises. When they arrived, Julian opened the front door wide, letting the light spill across the hall. This time Claire stepped inside, not as a stranger seeking shelter, but as someone choosing to return. Days began to unfold, not in grand gestures but in the weaving of quiet routines. Her jacket hung on the hook by the door. Her favorite mug sat beside his on the kitchen shelf. Curtains were opened. Plants lined the sills. Laughter echoed in once-forgotten rooms. Slowly, the mansion became less his and more theirs. One evening, Julian handed her a small silver key with a blue tag. "No pressure," he said softly. "Just thought it would be easier than knocking." Claire turned the key over in her palm, her chest tight with something she could not name. She slid it onto her keyring, the weight both terrifying and steadying. A year passed almost unnoticed, measured not by dates but by ordinary days. Rain still fell often, storms still rolled through the city, but the sound no longer meant loneliness. One night, as thunder cracked and lightning lit the windows, Claire sat curled on the couch in a thick sweater, Harvey snoring at her feet. Julian joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She smiled faintly. "You even remembered the cinnamon." "Of course," he said, as if forgetting was impossible. For a moment they listened to the storm, the fire crackling softly. Then Julian spoke, his voice contemplative. "The rain used to mean loneliness. Now it only reminds me of you." Claire reached for his hand beneath the blanket, their fingers intertwining with ease. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the haunted man she had met that first night, but someone who had chosen again and again. "To keep going, you stayed," he whispered. She shook her head gently. "No, we stayed." The storm rattled the windows, but inside the house glowed warm, not from fire or lamps, but from presence. Julian leaned toward her, his lips curving into a smile steadier than any before. "Best thing I ever said was asking you to stay." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Then let it rain," and so it did. Outside the storm roared, Inside, two souls scarred but searching had found something worth staying for. Not perfection, not certainty, but the fragile, unshakable truth of choosing each other, even when it rains.